Welcome everyone to this Coffee and Learn. It's actually quite interesting and exciting to be on this side of Coffee and Learn, because usually with Mark we are on the other side organizing these kind of presentations and sharing options. And I'm very happy that I can present some of the work that we have been doing as part of Learn. So as you might anticipate, I do have a PowerPoint presentation, but I will try to have this a little bit more, in some ways, there will be a couple of points where I would want you to kind of join in some kind of interactivity, but of course, that's up to you. Perhaps just to mention that this is being recorded, so if you don't want to be recorded, just feel free to turn off your camera or not respond to some of the content, but that's then up to you. And it's interesting that we have this presentation right now, because almost exactly a year ago, the first lockdown happened. So in March, I think it was 13th, but I'm sure that many of you will remember this date. We had the first lockdown and we had to start teaching from our homes and doing education at distance. And it's now 2nd of March, and a year has passed very quickly and very slowly. And just to mention that, of course, this study, I was leading the study, but of course it was also done with in collaboration with some of very great minds like Jessica, Roland, and Patrick, who helped in analysis and who helped in kind of figuring out what the results are saying. But so to start with what we know and what it means. Basically, how did we get to study COVID in this particular moment? When I joined EPFL, when I joined Learn, I started working on something that was called adaptability research, and basically this was to understand how teachers change their teaching practice by using different tools, by innovating with different approaches and so on. And then just about the time when I needed to start with the interviews, COVID lockdown happened. And this was an amazing opportunity, so to say. If nothing good came out of it, at least this was a kind of a good natural setting to examine the change and to examine how teachers use specific tools and use specific approaches when they have to. So there was an element of forced change. And since this was so significant and so interesting to understand what's happening in this point, we kind of focused almost entirely on understanding what these results mean. So this study is finished, and adaptability research, which kind of continued even with these circumstances, continued until recently. We've collected data, and we might have some early results in spring. But this is just to give an overview. And another really quick overview of the study is probably the most main questions on who and what and how. So the objectives kind of remain the same, with wanting to understand the experiences of teachers under conditions of now forced pedagogical change due to lockdown, with a very open-ended explorative research questions on how teachers experience this change and what this change means, particularly from social and technical perspective. To accommodate this open-ended design, we of course use qualitative research methods, in particular semi-structured online interviews, because of course we needed to do them online. And we collected data from 10 university teachers at EPFL in period of April and May. I must add that 10 might not seem much, but as it is a very much of a custom for qualitative studies, it was not the aim to find a representative sampling. It was not the aim. It was more the aim to really understand what is going behind, what is, how does this reflect, how do teachers reflect on these kind of changes, and what does this mean? So beside these 10 teachers, we have another 15 within the adaptability study. So that was kept separately. So we first focused on really understanding this data first and foremost. But before continuing further, I would like to engage you at this point and ask you to tell me under which conditions would you change your teaching approach or method? And you can choose multiple answers, whether it's because you find yourself bored or tired for teaching the same during these years, or you just discovered an exciting method that you want to test, or students might not seem happy, or you're suggested by someone, whether teacher, advisor, section head, or a pandemic happens and you think this is something that makes you change. Of course, I guess the last one will be an answer for many of us, but I wanted to see what else, what other conditions would you consider, why would you consider changing your practice? And in case you're not teaching, you might think of your any sort of practice that you're doing, a project, or why would you change your approach? So I give another couple of seconds, like something about now. So now I'm gonna end the poll and let's see. So can you see my, yes, you should be able to see. So most of you, and I'm actually quite happy, except the very last one, which is obvious that we should change when we are forced to change due to pandemic. But I'm actually quite happy to see that most of you answer that finding a new method would make you want to test it. And that means that lots of you want to seek out new methods, and this is something that is very important and very interesting. Also, lots of you answered that you would change if the students were not happy, or if someone else suggests, which is also quite interesting, and we will see how these kind of things appear in the study that we had. Are there any other reasons that you would consider for changing your teaching approach or methods? If anyone wants to add anything, please feel free to open your mic and just...
Yes.
Yes, Cecilia.
Eventually, I mean, I'm sorry, I didn't find I didn't find myself in the proposition that you had, and basically I would tend to take the second proposition but turns the other way around, which means I want to improve some aspects of students' learning. And I found a possible or something that might be a solution to this. Which basically needs, it's not because it's new and exciting that I want to test it.
I see. So
I first need to have something, a problem to solve before I test something.
I understand. So it's kind of a combination of the second and the third, where kind of not necessarily that students are not happy, but
it's not the students, me not being not happy on how they learn. The students might be perfectly happy about the lecture, but I might be not happy.
Absolutely, I understand. Thank you. Anyone else wants to add? if not, I would like to just tiny bit bother you for another poll. And this one is slightly different, the similar question, but to the opposite direction. So why would you definitely not change your approach? It's because nothing is wrong, it works well. Is it because students complain, but they don't really know why they're complaining? They don't know what's good for them. I mean, at the end of the day, it might be difficult, but it should be difficult because this is how we learn. Is it because there's not enough time to set it all well? Or maybe because there's not enough evidence and there's a fear that it's not going to work out? And maybe because you think nobody would gain out of it. I mean, you don't get anything, students won't get anything. You see the tool might not really work the way you would want it to work. Again, I leave a couple of more seconds. And voila, I'll close this. This is another interesting poll. And again, something very interesting, it's the time aspect, which again is something that we will see in the continuation of this presentation. But most of you, it's just because there's not enough time to test all the things that could be tested and to actually set it well so that it works well within your course or within your work. But it is also sometimes the fact that there's just not enough evidence to support a certain practice, or that there's just not enough to gain out of it. Again, I'll ask if anyone has anything else, any other reasons for which they might not change the practice. If not, I'll go further and just give a little bit on what does literature says about changing the practice. And interesting enough, whenever I read about change, I read it goes quite close to how we look at educational innovation. And it's always in a very positive kind of like, yes, we like innovation. Unlike the fact that historically innovators were seen as disruptors of law and order and disruptors of a certain way of conducting. Innovation today is still disruption, small or big, and it's considered as something favorable, if not necessary. And we can see, for instance, in general education literature, that innovation is quite welcome, but also in specific engineering education research literature, we see that it is an enhanced development. So again, something kind of positive that across time, when implemented, it requires parameters of creativity and overcoming of routine. And it's interesting, it's also associated with creativity, but as opposed to routine. And I would like you to remember this, because routine in such a manner is always kind of presented in a way that is kind of symbolizes, if you can imagine it in your head, a gray or brown kind of dark, dim room with old-fashioned furniture and so on. So this is kind of the idea, the image of routine that we get from when it is compared to innovation. And quite often pedagogical change in literature is described as difficult and a slow process, possibly because it's associated with political institutionalization, which means it's within a system that is quite political, quite controlled with very specific cultures, with very static cultures. And it also requires attitudinal change from people who employ this culture, including sometimes ourselves. But why is it also so difficult is because professional teaching practice is often put secondary to the academic research, and especially in engineering and in STEM, research is something that is quite highly rewarded, and Graham has been writing about this to quite some extent, that professional teaching is a little bit less rewarded by the system, so by the institutions, by a worldwide system of institutions, and also we often don't see people getting so much attention as they might get attention for their academic research. So often teachers are in a very difficult situation, being in a very difficult situation and in need to pick where to actually put the time and efforts, how to improve, like whether you will improve more in your research or in your teaching. And this is, I assume, quite difficult decision to make. There is also often lack of time, as we've seen even from the poll, and sometimes lack of training, and as I said, lack of incentives. But beyond that, we have also seen, and we used this graph to kind of simplify what happens when we innovate. So when we teach, and even when we do any other job, any other task, to become better, to become more efficient, we need to routinize certain tasks. So we kind of become expert in something. So it takes less time, less emotional effort, less stress, and so on. Whenever we introduce something new, which if innovation does, we break a little bit of this routine, and we kind of become a novice. And this is in a very broad way. I'm saying novice in a very broad way in terms of being just novel to a certain practice, so not necessarily being at the beginning of your career. But what, for instance, Bradsford and his colleagues who came up with this scheme imagine is that teachers often need, when they learn how to adapt and how to kind of improve their teaching practice, they often need both innovation and routine. And this is kind of where we can design this optimal adaptability corridor, where in the already well-established routine of teaching, we just add small bits and pieces. And Resnick and her colleagues call these kernel routines. It's another interesting term which we can imagine as small seeds of repurposed practice that can be easily adapted to new situations. So it's kind of like adding something new, but to something that we already know. And when Corona spread, and when coronavirus spread, and when we got into a lockdown mode, what really happened for most of the teachers who have, some of them never had the experience of teaching online, we really pushed this kind of routinized, well-based, on-site, efficient practice to emergency distance education, which was based in remote teaching and learning. And you could see this we could see this even in our data that, well, as Dimitri here says, and Dimitri is a pseudonym for one of the teacher interviewed teachers. What we see here is like, it was so surreal because he was teaching on Wednesday, and Thursday evening it was announced, well, we're going to be teaching from lockdown from the day after. And how, just to kind of add maybe a more global picture, so I found this in a European Commission document, a summary on open public consultation, and this also happened last year. So when the consultation took place, we can see the difference between using distance and online learning across higher education in Europe before and during the lockdown. So we see that for 30% of teaching staff, faculty, it was a novel practice. And this is how big of an effect this had. At our own institution, we, CCE and CAP, administered a survey just to see what's happening at the very beginning. It was a very quick response survey. And we can see that teleconferencing fatigue was lower in teachers than in students, and that large majority of teachers found the online tools easy to use. So the effect of the lockdown was not necessarily kind of too much to the technical and skills side. But what's also interesting in this survey is that still 50%, around 50% teachers estimated they could not teach as well as they would teach on campus, and most identified problems with lack of interaction with students. So if it's not with teleconferencing fatigue and it's not with the online teaching tools, we wanted to understand, okay, what's happening and why is it so that there's what's behind this interaction and what's behind these numbers that there is still 50% of teachers that could not teach as well as on campus. So when we analyze our data, basically this is what we came to. This is kind of our results in a glance. And we can see that technology was the first step to kind of overcome. Then came the routine, developing a kind of balance between where we are and what we need to do. And then came the role. And I would like to kind of just quickly go through this bit by bit with some examples from the study. So the first, most often the first thing would be getting the technology right. And we could see that, as the survey also suggested, the technology worked very easily, even for people who were not very, as John said, not being fantastic with new technology. Laura mentioned that it was also good because they could learn how to use it. And it was a good thing to adapt, to kind of learn a little bit more how to use stuff, the computers that we use every day. Then came the routine building, and with the routine building, there came a lot of kind of new knowledge. So we see that teachers express how what they very quickly learn. So for instance, regardless whether it was based from previous experience or with the experience with lockdown. So for instance, Gregor saying you have to create a scenario in order for preparing to prepare a good online learning material. Anne, who teaches exercise sessions, TPs, she said that she prepared these little videos and a lab setup behind her, and then she would pause, give some documents to the students to work, to kind of go through questions. Then she would restart with a whiteboard, scribble some equations, scheme, and pause again, kind of have an interaction without an interaction. These two elements, we saw that there was a lot of support that was very much appreciated. As Laura says, it was really important to have support centers because there were a lot of solutions that one can find there. It was, for instance, for her, giving online lessons, she had no idea when she was told how to do it, and having quite instant reaction from support centers like CCE, CAP, and SEDE was really important. Also, sections stepped in, as Nikolai explains here, that in our section, in our small unit, it worked pretty well because we helped each other with the technical stuff and everyone started making these videos. Then when these kind of really kind of emergency mode stuff was sorted, we could see teachers trying to understand where they are, what their role is in the kind of the new normal. Dimitri expressed it in a way that, well, we have these classes recorded and we can do something with them. But if you have everything on a video, what do you do in the class with the students? And he suggests here you have to innovate. Gregor, who has been teaching for a while in TPFL, he expressed that he knows what happens when he goes to the exercise rooms. He sees the students' scribbles, he can talk about it, and some students can listen, others will not listen. There's a million things happening live. And this is where we already see a little bit of a hint of interaction and how much the value of interaction is for the teachers when they teach. However, teacher-student interaction was there through all these kind of singular elements that we pointed out. So we've seen that, for instance, as Leopold and many others have said, I really miss the connection with the class. It's really, the sentiment here was not necessarily about, well, I need to control what's happening with the class, but there was a very genuine concern. And I have not put a quote for first year classes, but those who have taught first years or mezzaniveau, they were also very concerned with, well, this might be too much for the first year students to handle, too much for them to kind of digest. Jacques says that there's a connection that you don't have anymore, and it is monotonous, repetitive, a bit boring. So the teaching is not the same. And I think what sums it all up is what Benjamin says, I think teaching without interaction is not teaching. It's kind of something else. It's just a broadcast. So this kind of leads us to think about social and emotional dimension of teaching profession. And the emotional dimension of teaching, it is evident in the care for the students, and it often reflects. So for the teachers who do care, and many of teachers that I've talked to do care genuinely about students and how they learn and whether they're actually feeling good when they learn in their subjects, it really reflects in the importance of providing quality teaching. But for the teachers also, we see that the so-called reward of teaching is in the interaction, is in this little nod that some students do when we see them. It's in a student that comes down from 150 people in the auditorium and says something or asks a question. So and Zoom reduced this interaction to really just verbal transmission with very little visual feedback. We see that that decrease in efficacy can lead to anxiety. So, for instance, anxiety in terms of how we teach, it could be around, for instance, whether students will learn well enough so that they pass with good marks or stuff like that, and with frustration that you teach to this, as John says, it's more tiring. You talk to the screen, projecting the voice. And beyond this, we've seen from other studies that negative emotions related to teaching, so how a teacher feels about their own teaching, can lead to less flexibility and willingness to innovate or try new approaches. So we see a little bit of a withdrawal when a teacher does not feel very well about how a teacher teaches. So it's a kind of how John says, it's a little bit of a different stress, this projecting into the camera and not really having the chance to kind of interact even in a plain visual way. And what can we do about this? Well, one thing we can do with emotions is just recognize that they're part of teaching profession. Often we know that teachers stand as models for students, and students do recognize teachers and their emotions. So there has been several teachers who have said that, well, my students say, hey, I'm always smiling and I'm always in such a good mood. And this brings up the quality of teaching. So recognizing these emotions is very important. But even if we're frustrated while we teach, there is a notion that students will recognize this, and this will in a way reflect how we do education in a broad sense. As for the social part, we have tried to see learning and teaching from the social learning theory perspective using Wenger's kind of diagram. And Wenger basically says that while we learn, so it doesn't need to be intentional, but in general, when we learn, we do learn about doing. So we gain knowledge, we gain skills, we gain practice, but we also learn about meaning and how we experience stuff in a specific subject. On the other side, learning is also about becoming a part of community, developing a sense of belonging. And it is also about a sense of becoming. So students build a certain kind of identity through how they learn. So at the moment, I would want to stop projecting my voice and invite you to a small kind of reflection, an individual moment, if you like, to take 5 minutes and reflect on the following scheme. So how does your teaching approach support learning in terms of these 4 dimensions? I would invite you to do this for 5 minutes, and there will be like these 5 little points that will slowly disappear. And in case you're not teaching, just think about how you yourself learn, and what happens when you learn in terms of not only practice and experience and meaning, but also community and identity. So just take any piece of paper that you have around, or you can type on your computer, or even in your head for some 5 minutes, if we can do that now. And as this minute slowly ends, I would like not to disturb any thoughts, so you can continue working now or later on. But one thing that this kind of activity can lead to is kind of seeing these 4 dimensions of one's teaching. So this is just, again, this is just using the same framework to understand what knowledge and skills I teach when my graduates, my graduates will need in their future practice. Also what activities I can add in my teaching that can better support the conceptual idea about the subjects of my subject. How do I promote a sense of community with my students? What activities I can use so that they feel that they belong to this particular professional community, whether it's in a subject or in a more general way. And of course, what kind of message do I send to my students, who they are and should become, and how am I as a model to students who might identify with me and my subject? And this is just something that I would, it might be very subject particular, so I won't have everyone now putting thoughts together, even though that was at some point my thought, but this is something that we can use, and we can obviously use collaboratively with other teachers to kind of stimulate discussion, and maybe across the section stimulate something that could lead to better holistic education. And as my final slide, I wanted to kind of have a few discussion takeaways so that I have another maybe 10 minutes to kind of see your reactions and discuss a few things. And at the beginning, when we first collected this data, as Jacques said, we all worked a little bit in an emergency mode. So we are still finding how to best change and improve the way we teach in the long term. And this is not only for the next semester or for the semester after that, but what we can actually learn from here, and what we can learn from the fact that we do need this interaction, and that we do need to work, even if through Zoom and through online remote teaching, that we do need to kind of invest in community sense, and in kind of understanding what kind of what kind of interaction we can stimulate, and what kind of gains we can get out of it. And as Leopold says, probably the best way to start is to teach as a mix of the two. So to kind of see what's good from both worlds, and what can actually help us to develop teaching in the future. And as kind of main thoughts from the study, we kind of concluded that the meaning of teaching is indeed embedded in successful interaction with students. Hence, how can we better use and transform online tools to fit this interaction? Maybe we need to use other tools, maybe we need to kind of think out of the box, but what can we do to kind of keep this interaction, which actually means so much for teaching as a practice? And the second conclusion is that teaching is indeed an emotionally demanding and rewarding professional practice, and we should recognize this. But how can we work with emotions through interactive online tools and provide best teaching outcomes and gain the rewards? So the rewards in terms of kind of gain this positive outcomes on students and how students see this. How can teachers be supported in reflecting on negative emotions when the interaction is missing? So how can we kind of feel less drained in talking endlessly to this camera and not getting the interaction that actually rewards our efforts as teachers? So this is where I would end my presentation, and I would invite you to kind of just ask questions or give any reflections